Shalom TV's coverage of the 10th anniversary Limmud conference is made possible in part by a grant from Dr. Naomi Vilko, in honor of her mother, Olga Vilko, and in memory of her father, William Vilko.
This afternoon's session is entitled Why Amazement Matters, Abraham Joshua Heschel's Vision of Theology, Spirituality, and Ethics. And what I would like to try and do is really open up some of the most fundamental and important things I think Abraham Joshua Heschel is doing as a thinker. And I want to explain something about why I'm doing that. I have often thought and suggested in public that ironically, Abraham Joshua Heschel has been the victim of his own eloquence. And what I mean by that is, on the one hand, you could say, what are you talking about? This is a person who has gotten so much mileage out of the fact that he wrote so beautifully. And on one level, of course, that's true. And yet, on another level, one of the things that it has caused is that Heschel is very often treated as a kind of Jewish Bartlett's, right? I say this often to rabbis, and some of them find it funny, and some of them find it, I would say, less funny, is that all over this country, it's Friday afternoon, and a rabbi has a panic attack that he or she has no idea what she's going to talk about the next day. And they go over to the shelf, they pull down God in Search of Man, they find a line that speaks to them, and they're off to the races. And the truth is, Heschel repays that. There's a reason why people are able to do that, is that he wrote in this incredibly powerful aphoristic way. But one of the negative consequences of that has been that very few people actually do the work, I think, of digging deep enough to try and understand the deep structure of Heschel's thought and the question of what he's really trying to do. And that's what I want to try to spend a little bit of time opening up today, is to ask the question, what is Abraham Joshua Heschel as a thinker really about? And why should it matter to us, and maybe even matter to us deeply, as Jews and human beings trying to make our way through the world in the 21st century? That's not a small topic, I admit. If you were to ask a fairly educated Jew what one word they associate with Abraham Joshua Heschel, other than the Sabbath, right? The answer you would probably get is wonder. Abraham Joshua Heschel is, often thought of as Judaism's great poet and philosopher of wonder. And on the face of it, I actually want to suggest there's something very strange about that. Because if I asked you, make a list of the 50 foundational words of all Jewish spirituality, and make believe you've read nothing in 20th century Jewish thought, let alone Heschel. Make a list of the words you think are the building blocks out of which Jewish theology and spirituality are built. My guess is that the word wonder would not be on your list. By the way, what's the Hebrew word he's translating? The word is pele. Now, if I said to you, right, would pele be on your list of the 50 most fundamental words of Jewish spirituality? I'm not sure the answer was yes. And if it is yes, I would ask you, what about radical amazement? And what is that a translation of in Hebrew? The proof, of course, that that's not a translation of anything in Hebrew is, as there begins to be in the last few years an industry of translating and writing about Heschel in Hebrew, really for the first time, everyone who does that renders radical amazement differently in Hebrew, right? Hishtomemut radikalit, hishtaut kitzonit, all these terms, right? There is no term there. And the reason I think this is interesting is that it's question-begging. It's extremely striking, I think, that a thinker who understands himself as on some level engaged in the project of translating Jewish tradition, translating what the Jewish tradition has to say urgently to the modern world, sees himself as a conveyor of the past in some crucial sense, builds the whole thing on a word that you would probably not say is even fundamental to a Jewish spiritual vocabulary. And so I want to ask why that is. So I want to think a little bit about what does wonder mean, what does it lead to, and why is it so important? According to Abraham Joshua Heschel, all human beings are born with a proclivity to and an inborn sense of wonder. A sense of what he calls unmitigated innate surprise. And before we even define surprise at water, what that means, I want to just stop for a minute and draw your attention to that word innate. It was only after I published my book that I realized that the word innate is actually very important to him. And that's because, I think, wonder is not something that he thinks he needs to teach us that we don't on some level already know, but rather it is something that we all have by nature, and the job of a religious thinker and religious teacher is to tear away the calluses that prevent us from accessing that very primary awareness that we already have. That's an important thing to think about. If you're talking about educating children or raising children, are we trying to instill in them something that comes from the outside, or to awaken and cultivate in them something that is naturally there within them? That is also, I would suggest, one of the reasons why Heschel writes the way he does. He's not writing in a poetic mode just because he happens to be able to write beautifully. He's writing in a poetic mode because if it's his job to tear away the calluses that cover up our sense of wonder, he is aware that a 37-step analytic philosophy argument rarely sets your soul on fire, right? He actually has to write in a way that really undoes your defenses as opposed to just moving you cognitively, right? So because he's trying to re-elicit something buried within us, he has to write in that mode that is shaking us in some way. So for Heschel, what is really important is that wonder is a fundamental way of holding myself in the world. And he makes this very dramatic claim, I think, that all religion and all religious awareness is on some level rooted in that fundamental posture. Now we're slowly working our way towards what that posture is, okay? Now, what's the problem? What's the obstacle? Well, the first obstacle that he thinks is sort of endemic to our life is that routine is like spiritual poison, right? The more you do stuff that is the same all the time, the more your capacity to be surprised by it is undone, mitigated at least, and actually on some level undone. This is actually very important for him, and it requires an obvious caveat that we'll all think about, right? Since there is a need for daily wonder, there is a need for daily worship. All of this assumes that religion is not just reduced to yet another routine, right? Because we all know that religion can actually become an enormously deadening force, right? And one of the things I think you can't read Heschel without thinking about the ways in which, you can't read any good religious thinker without thinking about the ways in which they struggle with the gap between how religion actually works in the world all too often and what religion ought to be or could yet be. So what he's talking about here is the possibility of what it would mean to take religion seriously enough and heartfully enough that we allowed it to reinstill our wonder. I will say almost as a footnote comment that I think is interesting is, it is totally clear to me that if Heschel had been a member of Chazal, right, had he been living in the first few centuries and been a Talmudic sage, it is clear to me that he would have fought very hard for the word tefillah, prayer, which in Rabbinic Judaism comes to refer to the Amidah. He would have fought very hard for tefillah to refer to Psukei de Zimra. For many reasons, which I'd be happy to talk about during some of the interactions, but one of the main ones is because it is the ritual whereby we try to remind ourselves to be surprised, right? It is the attempt to remind ourselves of the sheer glory of being surprised. It is Psukei de Zimra is the antithesis to same stuff, different day, right? That's what it is. That's how it worked, again, ideally. Now, I want to say just very quickly also, it is often in popular presentations argued that wonder and radical amazement are synonyms. I think that is wrong. And I want to admit that one of the struggles that went into writing my book is Heschel is less than consistent with his use of language. I argue that he is more consistent than people who dismiss him think. Okay? But I want to say there are places in his writing where wonder and radical amazement seem like synonyms. And there are other places where I think they're not. And the distinction, I think, is interesting, at least worth thinking about for a moment. Wonder is this existential posture that I'm talking about, this way of thinking and seeing the world. Radical amazement for Heschel, I think, is what happens in the moment when I notice myself wondering. And then I'm amazed by the fact of consciousness and by the fact that my eyes are able to process the world. And then I'm amazed by the fact that consciousness is able to process itself and the second order consciousness. And then I'm amazed at the capacity I have to step outside of even second order consciousness, and so on. Right? Radical amazement is, we might call this reflexive wonder. It is wonder turned in on itself. I begin to wonder about my capacity for wonder. In other words, if that sounds abstract, let's say it this way. All moments of radical amazement are also moments of wonder, but not all moments of wonder are moments of radical amazement. It's more like radical amazement, I think, is what I might call, in my own somewhat absurd formulation, a high voltage religious experience. Whereas wonder is not that. Wonder has nothing to do with, I just had an amazing, right? It's not that at all, right? So another way of saying this is, Heschel thinks that we could, in theory, go through life in a perpetual state of wonder, but we could not and ought not go through life in a permanent state of radical amazement, not least because no one would ever make lunch, right? In other words, because you'd be lost in this sort of like existentially overwhelmed place, right? So, okay, now we're just about at the point of a definition. I want to issue one more caveat to get there. This is our bridge. It is really important to Heschel to point out, wonder is not the same as scientific ignorance. It's actually early 1950s when Heschel is writing this. I think he would write it even more forcefully now. It is very important to him that we not think of wonder as dependent on not understanding the way the world works. And on the contrary, as intensified, the more deeply we understand the way the world works. It's crucial to him to demolish the assumption, which ironically, this is sort of an obvious point, but it's worth saying, this assumption is shared often by religion's most passionate defenders and its most vociferous critics, right? The assumption that piety is purchased through ignorance of science, right? Richard Dawkins and his enemies agree on that point, right? It's just that they take different sides of which is preferable. Heschel really, it's very, very important to him that religion not be about the God of the gaps. Is that a phrase that's familiar? Yes. No. Okay, so let me just say something about that phrase. No one has ever said about themselves, I am a God of the gaps theologian. That is a term of opprobrium. It is a term of disdain from people who don't like people who practice it or who they claim practice it. And the God of the gaps idea is essentially this. A religious thinker stands up and says, I'm going to find all of the things that science has not yet explained. There's the hand of providence. There's the hand of providence. There's the hand of providence. The problem with that, Heschel thinks, is, first of all, it's a category mistake. It's not what any of this depends on. But second of all, those kinds of approaches only ever offer fool's gold. Because eventually a scientist raises his hand and says, gap closed. Right? And then where's your God? This is, by the way, if this sounds abstract, this is a major issue in contemporary American culture. You can think they are the greatest geniuses in the world or that they're doing something very problematic, but the intelligent design movement is actually an enormously powerful example of how God of the gaps theology works. Intelligent design is predicated on the project of insisting that gaps that most scientists think have been closed, in fact, remain open. Right? Oh, you think natural selection can explain every last step from there to here? I'm going to try, successfully or not, to poke some holes so we can reinsert a need for providence, right? The wing on that fly can't possibly explained by natural selection. Again, this is regardless of whether you think they're right or they're wrong. Heschel wants no part of that business, again, because it's a category mistake, but also because even if it weren't a category mistake, it's a very dangerous game to play. So if it's not God of the gaps, what is it? And here I think we come to the first definition, the primary definition of wonder in Heschel. I think for Heschel, and here I'm more or less quoting him, it is not this fact or that fact that points me to wonder and eventually leads me on to awareness of God. It is, in his wonderful phrase, the fact that there are facts at all. Right? The fact that there are facts at all. To put that more philosophically, and then again we'll translate back into English, wonder begins with an awareness of the sheer contingency of being. In other words, none of this had to be. Or, to quote from 20th century philosopher whom Heschel was deeply influenced by, although like every Jewish philosopher who is deeply influenced by him, he's very reticent about quoting him, Martin Heidegger, right? Why is there something rather than nothing? One of the striking claims I think Heschel makes is that religion begins, much of the time, religious awareness begins with this sense, this realization that none of this had to be, that I didn't earn it, that it is on some level a gift. That's what wonder is. Wonder is, why is there something rather than nothing? And when people popularize Heschel and say, oh, wonder is looking at this mountain or that lake, making eye contact with this person, or holding that child in my arms, I think they're right and they're wrong. That can lead to and come from the primary sense of wonder, but I don't think that's the primary sense of wonder. The primary sense of wonder, again, is, at least as I understand it, the fact that there are facts at all, or what he calls the unexpectedness of being as such, right? Fact that, why is any of this there? I want to point out that right now, we are about to take what for many people is a leap. For Heschel, it was not a leap. It was part of the same intuition. And my sense is, I am like very far from a sociologist, but I do spend most of my life teaching young adults between the ages of, let's say, 18 and 30. With every 5 years that pass, younger Americans, American Jews, find this to be a bigger leap than they used to, okay? And that is, Heschel believes that in the moment of asking, why is there something rather than nothing, there is already an answer implicit in that question. And that answer is a very faint glimmer that someone must have brought this into being. There must be a source. You see why, for some people, that might be a big leap? For Heschel, I want to make it clear, for him, this is not an inference. It is not, there is a world, I can't explain it, therefore I'm going to take a leap and posit there must be a God. It is an intuition. It is a kind of immediate intuition. Okay? So, the notion that the world just is, as Bertrand Russell famously said, the world is just a brute fact, right? I think Heschel felt that that was actually one of the most unphilosophical thoughts of the 20th century. What does it mean for a philosopher to say that's a brute fact? I thought philosophy was about not shutting off questions, and that's what you just did. So religion is born in that fundamental awareness, which again already comes, it does not mean, let me just clarify this so he's not misunderstood. It doesn't mean that he thinks with wonder comes an awareness of a God who loves me, cares about everyone, gave the Torah, and is in covenant with the Jewish people. It is what you might call a kind of pre-awareness. In philosophical language, a pre-apprehension. There's a dim glimmer of a sense that the fact that there is a world suggests that there's a source to it. I think that Heschel thinks, and in my view this is a serious weak point in his sort of methodology as a philosopher, that an awful lot of what we know about ultimate truths, we know through intuition. And that on some level, those intuitions are intuitions we should trust because they are so clear to us. I find that to be obviously problematic both because we know enough to question whether our intuitions are always trustworthy, right? One of the most fascinating things, if you ever read Man is Not Alone, should read that book with the following kind of trope in mind. Every few pages, Heschel stops and says, but how do we know that what we're experiencing is actually something outside ourselves and not just something within us? And then effectively says, we know that because the experience is so powerful that it is self-validating, or some version of that. The problem is, that is not really a philosophical argument. As William James famously said, right, someone who has an experience like that or an intuition like that has the right to believe that for themselves. But the notion that they're making an argument that someone else should find compelling is very problematic. In my view, the weakest thing that Heschel does is try to convince people who say they don't share his intuitions that in fact, if we dug deeper, we would. Right? That is, you can say extremely charitable, a little patronizing, or both, right? It's complicated, right? If you really believe that human beings are at their nature connected to God, and you're faced with someone who says, I don't have a sense of that, it's not crazy to say, I think you probably do, and let me help you find it, right? It also might seem a little paternalistic. The problem more fundamentally with a theology based on intuition is it has to wrestle with the fact that other people have other intuitions. And that's, in my book, I try to talk about this a lot. I think that is one of the great weaknesses of Heschel as a philosopher is he's not content to say, look, I have this intuition and I trust it, and anyone who shares this intuition is welcome to it, as I spoke about earlier today at the panel for those of you who were there, right? He wants to insist that everyone really shares this intuition. And ultimately, I think that's actually quite unconvincing. I understand why he wants that to be the case, because if it's just me and not you, your argument that it's subjective is stronger. But if we all have it, that must be the human condition accessing something metaphysical. It is what it is. I mean, one of the things that I try to argue in general about Heschel is he is much stronger at doing what he's doing than at doing what he thinks he's doing. I don't mean that in any way disrespectfully, but what he's doing is articulating enormously powerfully what the world looks like from an intuition shaped by Judaism and by a Western understanding of God. He thinks what he's doing is articulating a universal human intuition that is prior to any particular culture or religious conversation. I think that is singularly unpersuasive. And I would only say in his defense, he died in 1972. It is only in the years after that philosophers realized this idea that you can get under culture to some universal human intuition is a fantasy. And I often wonder, had Heschel lived 10 years longer, would he have wanted to revise parts of the first part of God in Search of Man? I don't know the answer to that. The question of sort of wonder and the question of where it all starts. Maybe I can just deepen this a little for people, if it makes sense, by contrasting for a moment Heschel with two people, Martin Heidegger and Richard Dawkins, lahavdil. So Heidegger actually seems to think, why is there something rather than nothing is a question, and if you try to move to a statement that, oh, there must be a source, you're actually undoing the wonder. I understand you have a theological itch, but you can't scratch it. If you scratch it, you're answering the question. And the whole point is to live with the question, why is there something rather than nothing? That's why Heidegger can ask this question, and it is not a theological question. Whereas for Heschel, what do you mean it's the most theological question in the world? Right? So that's one piece that's worth thinking about. Right? There are secular versions of this, and there are religious versions of this. Dawkins, in one of the, I think, most revealing passages in one of his early books called Unweaving the Rainbow, just titles itself fascinating, he says that the difference between a religious person and a scientist, and it is sort of smug in a way, but it's helpful for understanding how he thinks about it. He says, a scientist too is overwhelmed with a sense of wonder, but then adds, but we're working on it. And I think, Heschel's response to that is, you actually literally have no idea what I'm saying. Because your wonder is essentially curiosity ignorance. And so if I looked at the world and I said, oh, now I understand photosynthesis, end wonder. Where I think Heschel would say, are you insane? Right? I would say deepen wonder. So, so Dawkins misrepresents in many ways, well, let's just say it's a useful caricature of a certain reductive view of what wonder is. Oh, it's the same as ignorance. I think there is a very important connection between Heschel and Maimonides on this point. And I want to just for a minute, even though it's not my main topic, draw out the implications of this. Both of them begin very powerfully from a sense that the orienting event, the event around which all of Jewish spirituality begins, is essentially a sense that the world is created. One of the things that makes Maimonides, one of the many things that makes him so radical among medieval Jewish thinkers is, if you said to almost any medieval Jewish thinker, if you said to Yehuda Halevi, you invited Yehuda Halevi over for lunch and you said, what is the event that Judaism rotates around? Without question, Yehuda Halevi would say, Exodus and Sinai. Maybe Exodus. And most medieval Jewish philosophers would agree with him. If you said to Rambam, what is the event around which all of Jewish spirituality rotates? He would say Briat HaOlam, the creation of the world. One of the things that gets for him, that is why Maimonides can then go on to be the biggest universalist of the Jewish Middle Ages. After all, if your fundamental category is creation and the human, right, then on some level we're all, you and I came from the same biological process, same womb, in the words of various biblical texts, right? The problem with that, of course, is, as many people point out to the Rambam already then, if you start with such a robustly universalistic place, how is it that you're going to argue for the irreducibly necessary nature of this particular way of living? Right? If you start with the particular, there might be other philosophical problems, but if you said to Halevi, well, why is Jewish particularity important? He would say, I don't know what you're talking about. Jewish particularity is what structures the meaning of the world. The Exodus is the event that tells you who God is. The Rambam, right, is so universalistic in this way, but it means that he's constantly wrestling with, why Judaism? You can make an argument that Heschel has the same problem, right? Wonder is about something that is endemic not to Jews, but to humans. That is part of what gives rise, I think, to his profound universalism, and is part of what opens the criticism of, can you really make an argument for the irreducible necessity of Judaism? Is the connection between those two things clear? Right? I think it's actually quite fascinating. And in this sense, Heschel is very much a student of the Rambam, in very few other senses. But in this sense, I think it's very deep. Okay, now, where does all this lead us? And this is our next big step, okay? And again, now we're going to be kind of taking the next step in Heschel's thinking, okay? Heschel wants to make sure we know that wonder is not a state of aesthetic enjoyment, right? It is not, I go to the museum, I look at Rembrandt, and I think, how is it possible that a human being could capture the power of light like this, right? There may be a way in which that contributes to wonder, but wonder is actually, he says, filled with ceaseless tension. And that is because he thinks the following, that already in having a sense of wonder, I have this sense, this intuition, this inkling. Now I'm going to use the phrase that I think he uses more than any over the course of his writing career, the sense that, quote, something is asked of us. That when I begin to think about the ways that the world and life were given, I begin to have this sense that I owe something. That sense that I owe something, that sense that something is asked of us, I would suggest is the window, Heschel thinks, in human life that makes us interested in the question, or at least some of us interested in the question, what does God want? Right? If I didn't have a sense of wonder, if I walked down the street and I saw you and I said, you know, I have a Torah and God told us what God expects, you would say, that's not interesting. I don't care. But if I already walk around with a sense, right, that something is asked of me, I've been given something, I can't take it for granted, then when you come to me and you say, I mean, I'm saying this in a very crude formulation, but when you come to me and you say, oh, I have a Torah that tells me what God wants from us, you say, oh, maybe that's an answer to my question. So in other words, what revelation does, this is my formulation, not his, but I hope that it's helpful. If I have this sense that something is asked of us, revelation attempts to answer what and by whom. Right? That's where particular religion comes in, to answer the question what and by whom. And Heschel says this very beautifully at the beginning of the second part of God in Search of Man. He says the Bible is an answer, but the question has gone out of the world. That's what it means to live in radically secularized modernity, right? The Bible asks the question. The Bible answers the question, "Ma Hashem Elohecha shoel mi'imach," right? What does the Lord your God ask of you? And we say, who cares? I don't have that question. So Heschel's job, on some level, it's a window into what he's doing. His job is to bring that question back into the world. That's what he thinks he's doing. He is trying to open in the human condition a question that has been lost. There are all kinds of ways to think about this, right? All the different metaphors historians and sociologists have used for modernity, right? It's an iron cage. It's an immanent frame. It's closed off to anything transcendent. Heschel wants to open us to the possibility that maybe we do intuit some sense of obligation that comes from having been given something. Related to this, and I feel in retrospect I didn't write about this enough in my book, and I'm still trying to work out the relationship between these two things, is Heschel's sense that I think for some people it is totally obvious what he means, and for other people they think he sounds a little bit, sort of off the wall. The sense that everything in the world, if we look at it with a certain sensibility, alludes to something beyond it. The whole world is a vast set of allusions to the transcendent. That is the opposite of living in a radically secularized modernity. You can see that as the opposite of the disenchantment of the world in Weber's language, right? In a disenchanted world, nothing alludes to anything beyond it. And Heschel thinks about religion is about the realization that everything alludes to something beyond it. When I face a human being, on some level I realize that human being is a reference to something transcendent. If this were a different session and there were 10 people in here rather than 100, I would actually ask us to talk a little bit about, do you know what he's talking about? Because I have a feeling we'd have an incredibly interesting array of responses to that. Some people, oh my God, absolutely. Some people, when I was younger, I felt that, but it's gone. Other people, I never felt that before, and then I had a grandchild, and all of a sudden, the universe is actually pulsating with meaning in the way it never was before, right? There's so many versions of this and journeys human beings have around this question. But, so far we have this sense that something is asked of us. But I want to just mention this for a second. The soul is endowed with a sense of indebtedness, and wonder, awe, and fear unlock that sense of indebtedness. Wonder is the state of our being asked. In spite of our pride, in spite of our acquisitiveness, we are driven by an awareness that something is asked of us, that we are asked to wonder, to revere, to think and to live in a way that is compatible with the grandeur and mystery of living. What gives birth to religion is not intellectual curiosity, but the fact and experience of our being asked. And then crucially in source 7, how shall we ever reciprocate for breathing and thinking, for sight and hearing, for love and achievement? Or as he puts it somewhere else, we arrive at the realization that what we own, we owe. Now that statement, how shall we ever reciprocate, I think is essentially Heschel's modern formulation of Ma'ashiv Lashem kol tagmulohi alai, right? How can I, that religious sense, how could I possibly repay God for all of these amazing gifts that I have been given that I did not earn and that I could not have earned? So now, I want to make one big additional leap. And this next piece, I would suggest that this next piece, on some level, if you had stopped Abraham Joshua Heschel, over a cup of coffee and said, what is it that you are saying to the modern world that you think is extremely urgent for the modern world to hear? What is your message? I suspect he would have said some version of this next piece. Heschel argues that there are really two ways of being in the world. There is the way of wonder on the one hand, and the way of expediency on the other. And expediency is a very interesting word. For me, I always like to say, every one of us has some number of words that we have used a million times, read, and then all of a sudden one day someone asks us what they mean and we realize we actually have no idea, right? Ever have words like this, right? No, we all have words like this, right? What do we mean by expediency? For Heschel, expediency basically means a way of going through the world in which the only question that I ask about things and people that I encounter is, how can I use this? How can this serve me? How can this further my ends? The way of wonder, in contrast, is the way of appreciation, where I don't ask, how can I use this, but rather, what is asked of me? Ma Hashem Elohecha shoel mi'imach. What does the God of Israel ask of you? In one of his formulations, he says, I think this is actually in source 8, it's the end of source 8, in the way of expediency, we accumulate information in order to dominate. In the way of wonder, we deepen our appreciation in order to respond. In other words, the way of expediency closes me off to that which is outside me, because after all you're there for is to serve me. Whereas the way of wonder is radically open, is radically opening. Because I realize I was created, you were created. Right? I'm just going to throw this out there, and if people want to talk about this later, I will. This is not, it is crucial for Heschel, this is not some notion of the mystical oneness of all things. It is a notion of the oneness of all created things. Right? It's not, as sort of Neo-Hasidism will often say, everything is one. It's everything that God created is on some level one, and God is a transcendent creator of all that. Is that distinction clear? It means, in other words, if you ask a certain kind of neo-mystical thinker, they'll say, everything is one, and that big one is God. Heschel thinks, no, that there is a oneness that is everything that is created, but God is not that. God is not the world. The world is created by God. But what happens in the way of wonder is I realize you're created, I'm created. We live in what he calls a fellowship of praise. Or as he wonderfully says at one point, the earth is not our mother, she is our sister. Meaning both I and nature have been created. So there's no need for alienation, but it is also a sin to worship nature. This is one of the ways, for a topic for another day, why I think when people say in popular settings that Heschel is, quote, really just popularizing Hasidism, that is enormously too simplistic. He is taking pieces of Hasidic piety, but also rejecting, let's call it the pantheistic side of Hasidut, the notion that like God is the world and the world is God. He thinks that's basically atheism. We can talk about that during the Q&A if that's interesting. What all of this means, the way of wonder and the way of expediency, is that life is a struggle between self-assertion on the one hand and the possibility of self-transcendence on the other. And the core argument of my book is that self-transcendence is the core of what Heschel is after. And I want to explain what that means, because philosophers and psychologists sometimes use this term, and everybody uses it differently, and no one knows what anyone means by it. I think for Heschel, self-transcendence means something actually fairly straightforward. And at least a couple of definitions I'll offer. One is, let me put it this way. Self-transcendence is the development and the cultivation of what he calls transitive concern. Transitive concern means that I don't just care about me, I care about selves other than myself. It is the opposite of what he calls reflexive concern. He says something very beautiful about this. He says you cannot be an organic being and be alive without reflexive concern. You need to seek food, shelter, safety. That's part of being organic life. That's reflexive concern. But if all we have is reflexive concern, we have not yet arrived at a category that can meaningfully be described as human. And self-transcendence is the moment when I realize that your pain makes a claim exactly the way mine does. You matter. Things outside me matter. Now, the second definition is related, and it is the realization that my ego and my consciousness are not the center of the universe. Now, you can say, oh, well, that seems obvious. The problem is, and this is now me talking, not him, the problem is that requires realizing that the way we go through the world all day long is on some level an illusion. Because I go through the world every day, of course my ego is the center of the universe. It's the center of my universe. It's the filter through which I experience everything. I'm experiencing all of you right now through my own consciousness. And on some level, I am not a fan of saying that all religions are the same thing. I don't think that at all. But I think all religions and spiritual paths do have the aspiration to explain to people and give them tools for realizing that that is an illusion. My consciousness and my ego are no more the center of the universe than yours is. And in fact, when it becomes robustly theistic, when it really becomes about God, is the realization that the only consciousness that is truly the center of the universe is God. In one of Heschel's, I think, favorite images, we are all spokes in a revolving wheel. God is the center. And we have to overcome the illusion that we are the center. So, I want what you have. Okay, tough. Right? Unless we choose to share in some way. Right? So that becomes this path. Now, I want to anticipate a question someone will raise. Isn't it the case that most of us, most of the time, live in between the path of wonder and the path of expediency? Why these two polar paths? And this is something that I think you find religious teachers doing all the time, right? You set up two extremes to make a dramatic pedagogical point. And that is that on some level, even though most of us are what will be called in Jewish spirituality Beinonim, we're just people, right? We're not the most wicked people in the world. We're not the best people in the world. We're just people. I think that in the end, Heschel's response to that is, all of that is true, and yet each of us has a choice at every moment, not once and for all, but at every moment, to choose which path we direct ourselves towards. Right? Do we aspire to a life of wonder, or do we aspire to and embrace all too easily a life of expediency? Right? And that's very real. And you don't have to be a monster to fall into a life of expediency. Just think about how easy it is in your interactions with people within half a second to be thinking consciously or not, or to be thinking and lying to yourself that you're thinking it because you don't want to face it, right? How can you be helpful to me? What can you do for me? Right? And that is like the deepest spiritual work there is to overcome, at least for moments. I don't think Heschel thinks that anyone achieves self-transcendence once and for all. There is a reason why in rabbinic literature the term is kibush hayetzer, right? Subduing the yetzer hara. Chazal never talk about what some Hasidim will then go on and talk about, bitul hayetzer, right? Eliminating the yetzer hara. I always say, I hope this doesn't offend anyone, any teacher who suggests that they have achieved bitul hayetzer, make sure you know where your money and your daughters are. Because either they're a con artist, or worse, they're deluded about who they are. Right? Because in the end, self-transcendence is a moment-to-moment possibility. And just think about that. If that sounds abstract, just think about the ways which you can think about a moment in your life where you achieved an immense moment of really valuing the other, really making space for God, for other people, and 1 second later you could find yourself eviscerating someone or not seeing someone. It's so easy. The illusion that it's always doable is an enormous illusion. I don't think Heschel thinks that there's any contradiction between setting up self-transcendence as the ideal and affirming revelation. On the contrary, he thinks that what revelation does, and here remember what I said before about how religion could work versus how religion all too often does work. Revelation is the most powerful way, Heschel thinks, to put a brake, B-R-A-K-E, on human self-assertion and egotism. Revelation is all about you are not the center of the universe. You must recognize the reality of God and other people. Now, is it not self-transcendent to believe in the particular revelation of Torah to the Jewish people? I think that what Heschel, one of the things Heschel says in passing towards the very end of God in Search of Man, which I think is an extremely interesting sentence, is that it's not just human beings who are called to self-transcendence, but it's also, I forget at this moment if it's peoples or communities that he's talking about, right? That the Jewish people too have to be self-transcendent. By which I think one of the things he means is Jewish people have to have an answer to the question of what do you serve beyond today's golden calf, Jewish continuity. What is that? I mean, Jews should survive, so Jews should survive? That's not self-transcendent at all. How about something like Jews should survive because there's a vision of God and the good that Jews carry in the world? Or Jews should survive because the Torah is, right? Again, Heschel's understanding of the Torah, a radical call to completely reorient and flip the way we carry ourselves in the world. There is so much to say about this. Now, why is this so important in modernity? And here's really the last link in this chain, okay? The last link of this chain is that in the modern world, he thinks what has happened is we have embraced a culture of technology that puts the way of expediency on steroids. The only question that modernity asks us to ask is, how is this useful? Right? Modernity is all about technologizing the world, right? Everything becomes a tool. If you're interested in the history of philosophy, this will strike you as familiar. This is Martin Heidegger's famous essay, The Question Concerning Technology. Martin Heidegger famously says, if we were honest about what German life looks like, we would admit that the Rhine is merely a resource for the tourism industry. You'll notice in your packet, Heschel says, in an allusion I think people who know philosophy are supposed to get and no one else is, he says, yes, if we were honest with the way we live our lives, we would call the ocean a fish pond, and we would admit that the natural world is really just there to be used for whatever we want it to be. And even the way we talk, human resources, information resources, it's all stuff for us to use. And the problem is, he thinks, in other words, the Yetzer Hara, the problematic side, the evil inclination of us to use things, to constantly think only about how this can benefit me, modernity really exacerbates that. And it is profoundly selfish at its core. If that makes no sense, I want you to think about for a moment, I mean this not as a joke, the most desirable items in our culture are things called an iPad, an iPod, an iTouch, an iMac. That is not a coincidence. That is an appeal to something about the modern condition. It's all I. That is the opposite of self-transcendence, right? It's I. It's the culture of I. And he thinks that the danger of modernity is this is where we are. So now, this is important because he thinks that one of the reasons modernity has seen the enormity of atrocities that it has seen is that we essentially have dehumanized everyone around us into a tool. And he says very beautifully on a few occasions, one of the great consequences of turning everything into a tool is that eventually you see yourself as less than human too, right? It is a boomerang. You cannot throw that at people constantly and throw that at the whole world without eventually seeing yourself as just a resource too. I was reading an essay not so long ago by a philosopher named David Owens, which is amazing to me that he's a philosopher. He says, one of the consequences of a disenchantment of the world is that we can now see our bodies as what they are. They are opportunities to get us what we want, right? And it's just like it is exactly what Heschel's talking about. It is a kind of unself-aware version of this. Now, he says some very radical things here, and I want to sort of make sure we say these. He says that, human beings have become so ill that even religion becomes merely another tool for our own benefit. What is religion for? It is to get me what I'm looking for. I want a spiritual high. What do? I daven nusach karabach. I feel so great about myself, I become even more complacent. I'm not suggesting that has to happen. Please don't misunderstand me, right? But the point is, it can happen very easily, right? And we talk this way, right? I remember a little bit being heartbroken. I was reading a book, a very sweet book by an American who wanted to popularize a kind of liberal version of Musar in America. And he starts off really great. And then he ends the introduction and says, I invite you to consider how Musar can serve you. I thought to myself, Ribono Shalom, the world is not your waiter, right? Not everything exists to serve you. How about I invite you to consider how you could overcome an orientation where everything is meant to serve you. I invite you to consider how you can serve things greater than yourselves. That's self-transcendence. We fall into this all the time, right? I mentioned this earlier. I'm sorry for those who heard it. Some rabbis who I respect and like very much run around this country talking about encouraging Jews to hire Judaism to do something for them, right? That's Judaism as a tool, right? Now, I understand their goal is to meet people where they are and subvert. The problem is they become more like the problem they're talking about than the solution. Instead, why don't we say, Judaism does not exist to serve you. Judaism exists as an alternative for those who want to live differently than the world in which everything is a tool to serve you. It is different. It is countercultural. It is not just appealing to everything that's ill about the culture. He says further, God too, the ultimate sacrilege, God too is used as a tool. If you're a philosopher, this is the crude version of this. What does God do? There's a great American Christian philosopher named Roald Westphal. He says that in much modern philosophy, God is, quote, he who makes our systems work. Right? We have a philosophical question. Immanuel Kant, how do I know that living morally will one day be recompensed? I postulate the existence of a deity who guarantees that. Heschel says, I'm sorry. God does not exist as an answer to your questions. The whole meaning of religion is God asks you a question. The whole thing is about ayeka. The whole thing is about God's asking you a question, not you asking a question for which you posit God as an answer. And there are, of course, much cruder versions, right? God is the one who reassures me that my self-satisfaction is in fact theologically sanctioned. Now, if you laugh, it's fine to think it's funny, but I imagine you know what I'm talking about, right? And, right, ritual does this. I mean, I struggle with this all the time. Like, I have started saying to certain friends of mine who find this very hard to hear, I am not opposed to religious experience. I think it is a good thing and an important thing. But be very careful about making it an idol. Because you can have the most amazing davening in the world and go home and speak to your spouse like they're a worthless piece of garbage. And on that level, right, religion then is merely being used to reinforce everything that is selfish or unseeing of the other. So again, we always have to wrestle with the tension of what religion can do versus what religion all too often, we might say, does, right? Okay, one last sentence about this. How do we think about this on a very personal level? And I'm going to say this in the language of Western philosophy, but I don't care about the philosophy piece of this, okay? René Descartes famously says, right, I'm simplifying a little bit, but I doubt everything that exists. And then I come to the following realization. It's the proper translation of the cogito. I am thinking, therefore I must be. I am thinking, therefore I am. The one thing I know for sure is that I am here. And then I can start thinking about what else is real, and by extension, what else I want to be in relationship to. I think Heschel on some level would say that is actually quite an ill understanding of the human condition. Because before I can say I am already, there's a tremendous number of obligations and relations that I have. Before I can say I owe something to my parents, even if they were the most abusive parents in the history of the world. Before I can say I owe something to the person who manufactured the bed on which I was born. I owe something to the culture in which I find myself. In my language, not Heschel's, every human being is born already indebted and embedded. The notion that there is an I that is somehow prior to everything is crazy. And it is actually what facilitates an atomized sense of reality. I don't owe you anything. I'm what's real. For me, this has become very important, something I've written about, and not suggesting that this is how it began. But there's a very important truth in Jews waking up in the morning and saying modeh ani or moda ani and not ani modeh. And that is, I say grateful am I, not I am grateful. There's a philosophical claim there. That even before there is a self, there is gratitude. Even before I can say I owe something. Right? It's only because of modeh that I becomes possible. Or as my friend Michael Marmer likes to say, I thank, therefore I am. Right? That's a very profound Jewish claim, modeh ani. Right? It's a very powerful formulation. And I think that is self-transcendence. The moment when I realize that something else comes before the I, and that on some level there are obligations that make claims upon me, and that that's actually constitutive of what it means to be fully alive as a human being. And his job as a modern thinker, Heschel thinks, is to restore us to the kind of questions that open us to the possibility of realizing that before there's an I, there's obligations. That I am not the center of the universe. And that my ego is not a reference of ultimate truth. Right? Now, where did I start? Why talk about wonder? So, as I was finishing my book, I started thinking about why not, like Rabbeinu Bachya or Sadia Gaon, why not start with gratitude? Why start with wonder? And it occurred to me, it was very clear. Heschel feels he can't start with wonder in a universe in which people take everything for granted. Magia li. That's modernity. Magia li. I deserve it. It's mine. Right? Wonder is about the precursor to the possibility of talking about gratitude. Only if I can remind us that I didn't earn my life, I didn't earn the existence of the world, then all of a sudden you realize one thing is foreign, he says, to a religious person, taking things for granted. And only then, once I have introduced wonder, or help people rediscover what is innate, that is wonder, once I've done that, then I can move to a discussion of gratitude and indebtedness. And that's on some level what Heschel's fundamental project is, not just as a interpreter of the Jewish tradition, but also as a critic of modernity who sees modernity as just, as he puts it at one point, an inferno, right? This is where we live. And somehow, we have to find a way to discover again the possibility of self-transcendence, the possibility that the question that matters most is God's question to me, not necessarily my question about God or anything else. Thank you very much.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support Shalom TV with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double Chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the Shalom TV website homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive on DVD with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.